So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Chris, for that introduction. We're delighted as Clinigen as an organisation to be able to sponsor the World Orphan Drug Congress. We've been involved in the European meeting in November last year and are delighted to be able to sponsor this meeting in Washington this year. As Chris said, I've been involved in the area of early access for the last 6 years now, and during that time been involved in the implementation of making products available to over 100 different products available to patients with a high degree of unmet medical need. Clinigen as an organisation is a specialty pharmaceutical company in our own right. We own our own products. We make our own products available on a licensed and an unlicensed basis. But Clinigen Global Access Programme specialises in the consultancy, development, setup and implementation of access programs on a global basis on behalf of pharma and biotech companies. So what I'm going to cover over the next 20 minutes or so is just a very brief introduction to the subject of early access, why it's relevant to orphan drugs in particular, and cover a little bit about the rationale, the challenges, and the options available to you as pharmaceutical and biotech companies with orphan drugs in development. But firstly, I'd like to clarify what exactly is early access. Now, people call this different things. You'll see the terms expanded access, compassionate use, named patient, managed access, used interchangeably company by company and country by country. And what you find is that actually these terms mean very different things in different countries and to different people. So when we're talking about global early access, what we're talking about are mechanisms that exist to enable patients with an unmet medical need to be provided with access to medicine prior to that medicine being commercially available in that particular country. And that can be a medicine that's completely unlicensed everywhere worldwide, still in clinical development, or it could be a medicine that's licensed in one country but not available in other countries. The complexity is that it varies in every single country worldwide, and you actually have to use a variety and a mixture of mechanisms if you're going to provide your product on a global basis. So why is that relevant for orphan drugs in particular? Well, we're talking about products that by their very nature are meeting a high degree of unmet medical need. There are very often no therapeutic alternatives available for the patients with these diseases, and we're dealing with physicians that are looking to access these medicines for their patients. So why is this particularly topical? Well, I think we're seeing over the last 5 or 6 years the environment for early access changing and evolving and growing for lots of different reasons. Predominantly, I think the very nature of pharmaceutical and biotech companies' pipelines is driving that. We're all here today because we are talking about developing medicines in the field of orphan drugs and rare diseases. But aside from the pipelines, we're seeing situations with better informed patients, better informed physicians, and still market access delays to bringing these products to patients. We see patients are better informed than they ever have been before. Patients are researching their conditions, their relatives and loved ones are researching their conditions. If they're not getting adequate control from the medications that are available currently on the market, they are going to pharmaceutical companies and requesting and even demanding access to these medicines early. And we see these requests played out very publicly in social media, in the normal lay media of companies requesting access. And we've seen recently in the US very difficult situation that Chimerix faced with this particular individual boy requesting access to one of their products that was still in clinical development. And if you follow the news over the last couple of months, you'll see how that particular situation has involved. It's very emotive, it's very real, there's very real patients, and there is demand from patients to access medicine still in clinical development. Physicians themselves are better informed than they ever have been before. The international medical fraternity is very tightly knit, particularly in the field of orphan and rare diseases. This just highlights from ASCO. You look at the attendees at ASCO, over 50% of attendees at ASCO are from outside of the US. The international medical fraternity are very aware of products coming through development, and they're looking to access those medicines for their patients prior to them being fully available on the market. And at the same time, we're facing increasing challenges with delays in market access. You look at the statistics from the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. What they demonstrate is in Europe, even with a centralised approval process, in major markets like France, Italy and Spain, we're seeing 9 to 12 months delay for full pricing and reimbursement and market access in those countries after a centralised approval. It's still taking a long time to get medicines to market, even with orphan designations, even with fast-track routes. So you have a situation where you have better informed patients than ever before, you have physicians that are better informed than ever before, and still delays in bringing these products to market. As a pharmaceutical or biotech company developing a product in these particular areas, you have a decision to make. You have to make a decision about, firstly, will you allow access to your medicine that's still in clinical development prior to it being approved anywhere worldwide? That is a huge decision to make, and you can see the potential public relations implications and pressure that may be put upon you as an organisation if you choose not to do that when there are patients that could benefit from this product prior to approval. If you do decide to make your product approval, you have to consider what controls you put in place to make sure appropriate patients, appropriate physicians access that medicine. You have to ensure the appropriate regulatory and ethical mechanisms are met. How you collect information and data about the patients that are accessing the programme. How you deal with multiple country requests. We're talking about global access here, not just one country, where you could have an uncertainty of demand. You don't know how many patients would come through looking to access the product, and you don't know where those patients are going to come from. You have to consider how you resource making the products available, what your objectives are, and when is the right time to consider early access for your patients. But there are distinct routes that allow this to happen on a global basis. The US has very, very clear regulations and legislation in place. The FDA in 2009 updated its legislation to allow 3 distinct routes. You have a single patient IND route, an intermediate population IND, which is for up to 100 patients, particularly relevant in orphan and rare diseases, and a treatment protocol approach for larger group of patients. Very clear legislation in place encouraging companies to consider making their products available prior to commercialisation in the US. Unfortunately, though, when you get outside of the US, life gets rather complicated. If you look at Europe, for example, there are 2 directives in Europe that allow patients to access a medicine prior to approval. The beauty of Europe is every single country in Europe has taken those directives and transposed them into their national law differently. So in Europe, you have 29 different approaches and mechanisms for making your product available. The challenge with that is in some countries there's actually 2 or 3 mechanisms depending on the stage of development a product's in, whether the patient's been within a clinical trial or is a new patient that's entering an access program. It's complicated. And when you get outside of Europe, the legislation is even more complicated. And you look at emerging markets coming through, it's often not that clear exactly what route you should take to make products available. In this environment, you have the other challenge of different legislation often being in place when a product is completely unlicensed everywhere worldwide, it's still in clinical development, versus when it's approved in a major market. You have a number of countries that do require group protocol or group approaches being approved by the regulatory authority. The US, Germany, France are examples of those sorts of countries, versus other countries actually deal with patients on a case-by-case basis and allow individual patients to access the drug if requested by their treating physician. It also depends on whether you want to make your product available free of charge on a charge-for basis. There are a number of countries that will not allow you, when your product is completely investigational worldwide, to charge for the product. If you want to make it available, it has to be free of charge. There are other countries that do allow the product to be made available at a charge. There are also a number of countries that won't allow a product to be made available at all until it's licensed in one major market. So you have all these complexities to comprehend with. The good news is the legislation is evolving and changing and being updated. The last 6 months we've seen changes in legislation in Brazil, Germany and Peru. All the changes regulators are making is to make the process clearer, more distinct and more controlled. And that can only be a good thing for both physicians looking to access the drug and for patients in those particular countries. We see currently in countries like the UK, Serbia, Romania, Japan, China, New Zealand, there's still legislation under discussion, under review that should be coming through in the next 6 to 12 months to clarify and control these processes. So it's good news. Regulators are encouraging and making the routes more defined and clearer to allow patients to access these medicines. So if the routes exist, when's the best time in a product's development to consider making a product available through an early access scheme? Well, we see products being made available as early as phase 1, phase 2. And if there's a patient with an unmet medical need and the treating physician believes that patient would benefit from the product, we have seen examples very early stage of those products being made available to patients. I think it's fair to say, in the majority of cases, there needs to be an element of safety data in place to be able to assess the risk-benefit ratio of making a product available. And most companies do not consider making their products available until they have their phase 2 data in place. So either alongside their phase 3 clinical development program or even at the point of phase 3 results being available. One of the things I would consider, though, is also if you're in a pharma or biotech company that has a product under development, when are you starting to receive requests for access for that medicine from patients and physicians themselves? Because if you're starting to see a trickle of requests coming in very early stage from patients and physicians that are seeing the unmet medical need that that product is going to meet, then as the product goes through development and gets closer to market, then those requests will only increase. So my recommendation would be the best time to start thinking about putting an early access strategy in place is when you start to get requests from patients, because they will only increase if your product is going to be meeting a high degree of unmet medical need. But there's a lot of things to consider. So not only when you start receiving requests to access a product, there are a number of things that need to be taken into consideration. You need to consider what the regulatory basis you're going to be using on a country-by-country basis to actually make your product available to patients. You need to consider what material you actually have available, often something that's very overlooked. If you're going to make your product available early, do you have sufficient inventory or material to be able to grant patients access to the product outside the clinical trial environment? And do you have enough product to maintain those patients on therapy in the long term? You have to consider what patients you are actually going to allow to have access to the product. Do you want to restrict it to patients that may fall within the ultimate indication of the product or similar groups of patients within the clinical trials? Who are you actually going to allow to have access to the medicine? What information are you going to make available to physicians and patients alongside the product? If you are choosing to charge, what price are you going to charge through your early access scheme? What information do you want to capture through the scheme that could be useful for either health technology appraisals, potentially in the future? How will you manage the adverse events that may occur for patients accessing medicines at this stage of the process? How will you communicate to physicians, to patient groups, to regulators that the product is being made available? How do you do that in a way that's not seen as promotion? Because it is illegal and it's not ethical to promote unlicensed medicines. So you have to, if you're going to communicate, do that in an appropriate manner so people are aware that the product's available, but it's not in a promotional way. But probably the most important factor to consider when you're looking to make a product available through an early access scheme is your exit strategy. At what point is the scheme going to end? What happens if the worst happens and the product fails in clinical development? What if it never comes to market? What will you do? How will you consider supporting those patients that have accessed the product and potentially seen on an individual basis benefits to that product in the long term? What will you do at the point of commercialization? Will you expect those patients that maybe have received a product free of charge through an early access program to transition to commercial paid for supply? Or will you honour those patients' treatment in the long term? It's really important to consider very, very early on as you go into an early access scheme what point you're going to exit. And you might even need to consider that on a country-by-country basis, because regulations may dictate what you can and can't do when you do have a product that is actually approved and on the market. So there's a lot of things to consider when you're contemplating putting in place an early access program. So if it's so complicated and there's so many considerations and it's outside of your core strategy, because clearly this does not replace in any way the clinical development program of any product, that should be the priority, and the ultimate objective is to bring products to market fully approved, fully priced, fully reimbursed. If it's so complicated, what are the benefits of doing this? Well, I think the primary benefit that I would see is seen as a very ethical way to respond to patient and physician's demand. It's a very morally sound thing to do, if you can, to be able to allow patients with a high unmet medical need that often cannot wait for that product to come to market to be able to access your medicine. It certainly accelerates the access for specific patients, specific physicians to innovative products when treatment options are limited for them. It definitely gives you a way of having greater links with the medical community. Outside of your core investigator group, it may allow a broader group of specialists to access the medicine whilst it's still coming through clinical development. Whilst you're not capturing controlled data, because this is not a clinical trial, you can capture interesting information, real-life, real-world data about how your product is being used, where it's being placed, and the results that you're getting. And we see quite a lot of particular case studies being published on individual patients or groups of patients that physicians have that have accessed medicines through an early access program. You certainly can control your medicine supply, and you can manage the risk if done in the right way, and you can maintain supply chain integrity, ensuring that if you're making your product available, patients are accessing real material with no counterfeits in the process. And also, in the longer term, particularly in the field of orphan and rare disease, where you're not entirely sure of the commercial viability of launching in 20, 30, 40, 50 countries on a global basis, you could actually consider these types of mechanisms in the long term for smaller markets to allow patients a route to access, even if you're only going to commercialise maybe in the top 20, top 30 markets worldwide. So there's some benefits long term once you get out of the early access stage. So I'm not going to go through all of these particular points. It's some considerations to leave you with, and these will be available in the slides that are available after the conference. But if you're sitting in a pharma or biotech company with a new product coming through development, an innovative product for an orphan or rare disease, where do you start in considering your strategy for early access? Well, if you can answer all of these questions, that's a pretty good starting point. If you internally can take a good view on how and when and where you'd like to make your product available, then you've got a good starting point on a lot of companies that haven't even thought of this as their products coming through development. So to summarise, there is a clear demand for considering early access as part of your market access strategy for any innovative product, but particularly in the area of orphan and rare diseases where there's such a high degree of unmet medical need. There is clear demand from patients, from advocacy groups to access medicines earlier for people that have conditions where there are no treatment options available. There's demand from the physicians. Physicians treating patients in rare diseases are aware of products coming through development, and they're looking to access them early for their patients. The regulators are encouraging this type of activity and going gradually about clarifying the routes, making them more controlled to allow patients to safely access medicines while they're not yet fully approved and on the market. There are clear benefits to making these products available through an early access program. For patients, it's obvious. There's treatment options that just wouldn't be there otherwise. There's benefits for the physicians treating those patients, and there have to be seen to be benefits for pharma and biotech companies. Otherwise, why would you want to make it available? But it's a complex environment. There is unknown demand, and it makes it very difficult practically to actually implement these programs. And that's where the final question comes, is how best is to do that. Whether you look to try and do that internally, to use internal resource to make a product available, or whether you consider outsourcing to a specialist that can help manage access to your product whilst it's still at this stage of development. That's all I have time to be able to talk to you about. It's a very big area. There's a lot of questions that often come up about this. We'll be at the conference until the end tomorrow. If you have further questions, please come and ask me, and I'll be delighted to answer them.
Mark, we got a diverse audience in the crowd, and real briefly, can you just summarize what are the countries that have some mechanism to provide reimbursement for early access? And if you could also say, which of the countries would you say may have the more difficult, onerous pricing approvals under a regulatory approved product?
Okay, that's a huge question.
Well, just list it. You don't have to explain, but just so people have a sense who aren't as close to the industry.
Okay. So when your product is completely unlicensed worldwide, then there are a number of large markets that will allow you to charge for the product. The US has a mechanism for allowing companies to charge for recovering the cost of making a product available through a treatment protocol. That is rarely used, but it is possible. The big markets where you can't do this in Europe are Germany, Belgium particularly, and then there are a number of large markets where you cannot make your product available free of charge or charged for if it doesn't have a license worldwide. And the big markets to consider there are Japan and Russia, particularly, as well as a number of smaller, particularly Eastern European countries and places like Israel, where it's not possible. So there are actually quite a large number of countries. It's easy to give you a list of where you can't, but where you actually can charge for a product, even when it's still unlicensed totally worldwide.
All right, that's fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you.